Good morning, you all. Today is Thursday, March 26, 2015. This is a special meeting of the Prescott City Council. Roll call.
Mayor Kirkendall?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Kuknio?
Here.
Councilman Arnold?
Here.
Councilman Blair?
Yes.
Councilman Lamerson?
Here.
Councilman Lozelle?
Here.
Councilwoman Wilcox? Here. All present.
Okay. Craig?
Item 1A, fiscal year 2016 budget workshop number 2 presentation, discussion of fuels reduction in the wildland urban interface to enhance fire-wise community safety and the budget topics.
We had the pledge on the agenda.
It's your show.
We're going to do the pledge this morning? It was on the agenda?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Chris, volunteer.
Sure. Please join me in the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah. Mayor and Council, this is budget workshop number 2 pertaining to the fiscal year, the upcoming prospective fiscal year 2016 budget. As number 2, this is the opportunity to focus on particular topics of importance as they relate to the draft budget, which you will be receiving in May. This particular workshop this morning is to focus on wildland-urban interface and wildfire reduction and how we go about achieving fuels reduction for community safety. Presentation this morning is going to be made by Chief Light, our fire chief. So with that introduction, Chief, why don't you proceed?
Morning, Chief.
Good morning, Mayor, Council. Before I get too far into this, I'd kind of like to just preface, I've kind of designed the presentation to be interactive. As we proceed through the presentation and the slides, if you have any comments, questions, concerns, or issues that you'd like to bring forward, I'd ask that you feel free to interrupt me as best as possible, and we'll try to keep things moving, that we don't dull it down to the point where we're sucking the life out of you. But I have a lot of fairly important areas that I'd like to touch on this morning, and we'll get going.
Okay. I've got a meeting at 3. You think you can finish up?
Well, if we're here at 3, I'm going to be up here with my tummy grumbling a little bit more. So, yeah, we'll most certainly be out of here by 3 o'clock. A little bit about the topics I'm going to have a conversation about today. First and foremost is what our wildland fire hazards look like here in the Prescott community. We're going to go over a little bit, and I apologize if I get stuck in jargon every once in a while, but if I use an acronym or a term of reference that you aren't familiar with, just ask me to explain it. Every once in a while, when you work in a profession for as long as I have that natural tendency to use some acronyms. But probably the first one you will hear, though, is the Wildland Urban Interface. It's commonly referred to as the WUI, W-U-I code, and I hope to provide you a fairly macro perspective and an overview of that particular code. We're going to touch a little bit about property owner and responsibilities of community members in regards to helping us help the community and mitigate some risk within our community. We're going to touch on the code enforcement piece that comes inherent with any sort of code is code enforcement, and then we're going to go into the city role and responsibility in regards to fuels reduction and firefighting. And really there's about 5 subtopics in that particular area that'll get down a little bit into the weeds, but without going too far down into the grass, and that will kind of provide some overview, some strategic direction that I'd like to move forward with as an organization, and some of the personnel changes that might entail. A little bit about the wildland hazard. I need to transition on the Elmo here on this one. This particular piece shows the Prescott National Forest fire history since 2000, courtesy of the United States Forest Service. And I'll bring it up.
Chief, just mention that this is not in the packet. I see everybody leafing through their
Actually,
packet.
it should have been an addendum to the packet. There was a second piece.
Didn't make it.
Right here.
Oh, the handout?
It's a separate handout, sorry.
Okay, very good.
Anyways, this was the history since 2000. And what you see to the south of town is the Indian Fire of 2002. And then to the slight west of town, burning from a south to north, is the Dose Fire. The variety of red dots throughout the pictograph are primarily starts that we've had that has had some sort of response within the Prescott National Forest boundaries that also had the potential to threaten our community. I'm not a master of technology.
That's okay. That's why Woodfield's here.
Anyways, as most that are familiar, we're pretty much surrounded by both state and federal lands within our community. We do have a piece of reservation land for the Yavapai Indian Reservation that is within our incorporated and unincorporated areas, but we're basically surrounded on three of the most volatile sides by the state lands, state of Arizona, the Prescott National Forest, and then the community itself has built itself into the WUI. Unlike a lot of other communities, one of our challenges here is that the town is in the direction of the prevailing winds that have a tendency to become most significant in the area. What that means in layperson's terms is a fire that happens in these areas, whether it be natural or man-made cause, has a direct impact or has the direct potential impact to affect this community in one way or the other. It could be as simple as just the smoke drifting into the community, or it could be more as what was seen in the Indian Fire and the Dose fires. This one's a little complex, rather difficult to see, but the tan colors or orange colors, depend what color you call that, are the areas that are within the planning zone for the urban wildland interface zone, or the WUI zones. There's an area slightly cranberry in color in the middle of that map that shows areas that were formerly in the WUI that have, through either mitigation efforts or just determinations, been pulled out from the WUI, and then the corporate boundaries as developed. So as you can see, the pictures kind of tell the story a little bit as to how our community is intertwined with the wildland-urban interface.
Chief, can I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
I know that we have this mapped out for the city, but when you look, there's a lot of areas that are coming in that aren't in the city because we got little county islands and inlets there. What are we doing to coordinate so Prescott isn't standing on their own with that for these other areas? Are these being addressed by Central Yavapai? Are they being addressed by the county?
Yes, it's a culmination of efforts. There's quite a strong partnership long before I arrived last summer that's been well established between the federal partners, the United States Forest Service, the state of Arizona, the Forestry Division specifically. We've worked to clarify and solidify some of our working relationships, and really one of our main partners, as much as anything else, is the POWIC, or the Prescott Area Wildland Urban Interface Commission, which is a 501c3, I believe it is, might be a C4, body that helps us help this community. And the partners all take part in their monthly meetings. Bob Betts is here in the audience today that can speak specific to POWIC, but through their, the leverage that we get and the cooperation we get with the different partners, that all of them work towards some degree of mitigation within this community.
Mm-hmm. Chief, why don't you go back to the map, the previous slide? Just to make a brief point here, as you can see, a lot of the city is in the wildland urban interface, which is that tan color there. So when we talk about code enforcement and responsibilities of property owners, we're talking about most of the community, not just up in the trees or what some people would think is up in the trees, but a substantial portion of our community where property owners do have responsibilities according to that adopted code, and the chief will get into what those code provisions are.
A little bit about the history. Most of you were here through the evolution that the Prescott Fire Department is undertaking in regards to fuels mitigation. But I'll kind of back it up a little bit. But the wildland fire capabilities, the operations and services grew out of a more recognized need for fire prevention and risk reduction within our community. It concentrated its efforts on defensible space and building a community knowledge base that folks understood what the risks were and be able to address those. In the early era, early being 1991 to 2000, after some significant fires, primarily in Southern California and throughout the state of Arizona, a new model was kind of embraced to work towards fuel mitigation. And when I talked with what I would call probably the local area's personal resident expert, Tony Shaka, one of the big fuel strategies, even in the acreage on state and federal lands, has been to not deforest, but to thin out the risks. In the 91 to 2000 era, it was not uncommon for 100, 120 trees per acre. The new model kind of follows the line of 60 to 70 trees per acre. By thinning the lands or doing brush reduction, fuels reduction, it lowers the risks. And that combined with a little bit more, I'll get into a little bit of the finer detail, reducing the risk from ladder fuels, the ability for a fire to go from a ground level to a ladder fuel, which is the lower lying branches, and get into the canopy of our natural resources around here. We want to stop it at the ground level. The biggest challenge once a canopy fire starts, it's called crowning in the industry, is it has a tendency to have longer fuel lengths and be able to jump bigger and greater distances, therefore creating a higher intensity fire for the community to deal with. 2001, some of the monies became available through grants. Most notable at that time was the State Fire Assistance Grant, and that allowed the Prescott community to start working on some defensible space. It was kind of the inception of doing preventative work, kind of like, you know, every once in a while, you know, you have to wash your car and you know, add a new clear coat or those kind of preventative measures. Forest mitigation or fuels mitigation works in that principle. It's getting out ahead of the risk and before we have an event. And in order to, when you do have an event, to minimize that particular challenge that it presents. 2001, there was a community-wide vegetation management plan developed courtesy of Hunt Research. In viewing that, it's probably time that we need to re-engage either through some sort of risk management needs, but we need to get another updated picture. That's been about a decade and a half since that was done, but we need to look forward a little bit and do some further identification of our local risks and how to address them. That plan outlines some different specific areas of treatment that we were able to accomplish, yet not all those have been completed for various reasons, but many of them have been completed. 2002, fast forward a little bit, and we engaged with the Indian fire. And if I can transition one more time here. One of the interesting facts on the Indian fire of 2002 was the highlighted private parcel full cash values. That was to the tune of $179,276,000. That's identified by the area in yellow. The fire started again south of town, progressed rather rapidly in a very short term, And if you kind of look at the notch out in that particular area there, one of our advantages to some of our fuels mitigation work ahead of the Indian fire stopped that from progressing at that particular area. So if you want to look at a success directly contributed or attributed back to this community and its fuel reduction efforts, that probably is a standout piece of that work. A combination of available air resources that were available at the time, not somewhere else fighting fires, along with a very concerted and very direct initial attack, prevented this from becoming a true catastrophic event in this city's history.
Chief, has there ever been a conclusive, I don't know what the better word is, assessment as to how that, who, what, and where started that fire?
Councilman Lamberson, I'm not ultimately familiar with the specifics as to the origin and cause of that particular fire. I believe it was a human-caused fire, that an individual later on had been prosecuted and was held accountable as best as you can hold people accountable for these kind of things. That's the best of my understanding.
Thank you for the best of your understanding.
Very good. Subsequently, and this is kind of interesting, but Prescott actually became the first city to adopt the WUI code, or the Wildland Urban Interface Code. By its design, it's really in the urban, suburban areas of town, and it was designed to minimize the threat to both life and structures. And in the fire service, I use the term LEP, which is life, environment, and property. And that is in somewhat of a priority order, with life being the most paramount element that we'll commit resources to. Environment and property are kind of parallels amongst them. I remember it because it's a little easier to put the vowel in between the two consonants and remember it that way. So environment and property both carry equal weight, but life is the most impressive piece that we need to work towards saving. Again, moving forward to the development and the up till the tragedy of June 30th of 2013, we rolled out collectively in this community a Type 2 team, which is a little lesser capable unit, which was the inception prior to the Granite Mountain Interagency Hotshot Crew being formed in circa 2008. That was a Type 1 interagency team, primarily responsible when they were in town for fuels mitigation and treatment of properties, both in the rights-of-ways, city properties, and to some degree helping out the community members. But in a lot of cases, they were doing what's called off-district work. They were outside the area, irregardless of where we were at within our fire season here locally. They'd catch an assignment and be gone for periods of up to 2 to 3 weeks at any given time. Again, some of the work that they performed, some of the hand crew work, for those of us that are in the military, kind of the grunt work, the boots on the ground, able to do a lot of the mitigation and treatment. They provided some chipping of vegetation and removal once the property owners got it to a defined location. They provided some degree of initial fire response within the Prescott community. And oftentimes, as I shared, they were on extended deployments elsewhere throughout the Southwest, the Northwest, and for that matter, at a national level.
Did the Type 2 also provide that when they were here, that didn't leave Prescott at that time? They concentrated on Prescott?
From what I understand, both teams had a deployment off-district type of response. Normally a recognized Type 1 was a more global, further out of district than what a Type 2 team would provide. But from what I understand, and I may not have all the information, I wasn't here at that inception, but I feel very confident that they were doing off-district work at that time. And off-district, in my verbiage, is outside of Yavapai County and our mutual aid, automatic aid partners.
Thank you.
One thing I can speak to a little bit is formal audits, to my knowledge, haven't really been qualified or codified. However, when we look at the numbers informally and historically, there's a lot of folks that are under a myth that off-district response brings revenues to the city. I can attest, after signing many invoices in my previous administration that I worked, that if it's revenue neutral, that's a positive outcome. Usually there's salaries that we're paying for the people that take part in the off-district response. There's salaries we have to pay for that are recovered through a cooperative fire rate agreement, but it's probably closer to being revenue neutral than being a true revenue maker. Even in fiscal year 13, kind of a snapshot, very rarely was the wildfire division or wildland division was not self-sustaining or self-supporting through grants. There was still general fund outlays of roughly $200,000 to $300,000 a year dedicated to that particular division. Again, coming up to the present time and in recent history, there's been discussion since 2013 on how to most effectively and efficiently provide for a positive outcome to our community in fuels reduction, minimizing risk, and how we can work better with property owners or non-for-profits and other governmental entities. I would say we're probably at a very strong point in the City of Prescott Fire Department and the other districts' cooperative efforts. I have probably I won't say a standing meeting, but every couple weeks that I have a good conversation, usually over lunch with Chief Freitag and with their joint management authority. And in turn, I think collectively we're working to look at efficiencies in all risks, not just the wildfire risk, but I think the relationship has been solidified over recent times. First and foremost, fuels reduction is a necessity within this community. There's no getting around the need to enhance public safety through mitigation efforts. As I shared on some of the earlier maps, we kind of sit in the bowl being the downtown and Prescott area community. To the south, west, and east is forested lands. So with that, our geography, our arid climate, for the most part, our fire season here runs anywhere from, I think this year it's a little later start in coming because of the winter moisture. But you can almost set your clock to it coming about early May through June, and then 4th of July weekend, hopefully we see the monsoonal rains and eases our angst. With that comes the prevailing winds out of the south, the pop-up thunderstorms, those kind of things, which all contribute to the risk potential. There's a blend of public and private lands throughout much of the community. And as we look forward and have this conversation, the basis for city policy is to actively address the hazard through risk reduction and mitigating those risks, and therefore provide some degree and some expected level of protection for our community. And then confirming, adopting, and implementing policy. We want to have some defined outcomes. And I'll touch on grants here in a little bit, but each one of our grants has a deliverable. We'll provide a scope of work to the granting authority. Within that scope of work, we'll define certain deliverables that we expect to complete by the term of the grant. And we've been very fortunate to be successful dating back almost 10 or 12 years, that we've hit grant after grant after grant to help us sustain some of this. That said, as a chief executive, I have a very difficult time defining a business model solely on grants, because there's nothing in a granting authority that says it will be an infinite amount or it will be for an infinite time frame. As state governments get involved and federal governments, we do fall to their whim a little bit. And with that, you know, the outlook in the current role, and I'll get to it a little bit more, is very positive that those will continue. But as the dollars get tight, everybody tightens their belt and looks for those discretionary monies, and grants seem to fall off the table fairly early. Providing resources and achieving the outcomes are very critical to a fuels reduction program being comprehensive for this community. Most of this is fairly recent history. Most recent this past fall, where we went through and presented a series of codes that current elected body has adopted by ordinance. In later part of 2014, we adopted actually the 2012 Wildland Urban Interface Code. It didn't differ a lot, but through our amendments in that, we've kind of focused some areas, and I'll touch on those in just a moment. A little bit about codes, and not to relive what you guys have already sat through a few times about codes, but they're really designed to enhance the community and the public safety. The work environment, business models change over time, and with that, materials change, lessons are learned, and we have to be adaptive in our leadership style of addressing these concerns when they present to our community. Provisions of the WUI Code specifically address buildings, construction, alterations, movement, repair, maintenance to structures and premises within that tan area on that earlier map. So that is what the targeted piece of the WUI Code is. You also have the basic fire codes that do stuff for some of your commercial properties and that within our community living. Probably very important within the WUI Code is it also empowers the Prescott Fire Department to serve as the fire code official. It empowers us to the point where we can enforce the code and provide direction to the building community, the community residents, in order to create the safe environment. And then it also puts back to the community an obligation for them to be supportive of the code in regards to managing vegetation in the WUI area, the Wildland Urban Interface area. And specifically, and there's a slight graphic on the next slide, but it defines specific areas around commercial and residential properties related to managing risk. And those are called fire management zone, or correction, vegetation management zones. And a correction to this particular slide, zone 1 is actually 0 to 10 feet. This was probably the best depiction I could source for this presentation. But zone 1 is 0 to 10 feet, zone 2 is 10 to 30 feet, and zone 3 is 30 to 100 feet surrounding the properties. This is routinely the property owners' areas of concern that they need to be responsible for. And when we talk about defensible space, it's primarily, aside from an encroaching fire moving into a property, to give us a chance of saving that particular property. Most of our folks that you see out and about in the community in the big red trucks, their primary role in the wildland environment is property conservation or structure protection. We do have some that are capable, some of our apparatus are capable of direct attack, but much of what the rolling stock of the Prescott Fire Department consists of is dedicated to structure protection, because that is the at-risk piece. A little bit about just some of the terminologies, and I'm going to step you through just 3 slides here, but ladder fuels are common references. Those are your grasses, your shrubs, and your scrub oak that allows a fire to get from the ground level up into the higher levels. In the forest particular, it's your needle bed, your ladder fuels, lower lying branches, and then you have a canopy. And they try to eliminate those ladder fuels as best they can in order for it to stop getting in the canopy areas. Another point about the fuels itself, they are what determine flame lengths and fire intensity. So much like some of us have to have our hair thinned out every once in a while, brush and vegetation works the same way. We have to thin it out in order to stop and allow it to grow healthy. And another piece to that is the removal of non-native vegetation, stuff that wasn't there when it began, but might have been introduced for various reasons, whether it be just by natural reasons, something's blown into the area, or other reasons that this has promulgated within the urban interface.
Chief, is there any consideration given to the type of vegetation that you can remain standing? And is there any consideration to aesthetics? In other words, how the tree is trimmed and shaped?
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I definitely am not an arborist or a landscaper, or professed to sleep at a Holiday Inn last night to play one today. But there is certain technique that we use to trim stuff. And the next slide kind of shows a thinned out version of that same shot after some of the fuels reduction piece has been removed. And you can see that the house in the background there is now defensible. There's certain ornamental plants in that are only allowed within zones 2 or 3 and can't be right up against the property in zone 1. But what we want to do is maintain a natural appearance, trimming the trees at the lower levels in order to stop those ladder fuels from moving on up and creating longer flame lengths to have to combat should an event occur.
Is that spelled out in detail in the code?
It has some degree of detail. It's not to the degree of specificity to say, well, you can have a ficus tree here or a palm tree there, but it does talk about ornamental vegetation and stuff. You know, in different communities, it is different fuels. I had a conversation with Chief Galliard of Flagstaff just this past Monday, and talking about fuels reduction, and the fuels that the Flagstaff community faces are different fuels than what the Prescott Basin faces. And with that, we try to, much like we want to put a primer coat of paint on before we put the regular paint, we want to have vegetation that doesn't promulgate intensity in fire. And we try to look at that. And we also have some folks that are pretty knowledgeable as to the arborist piece of that on staff that help homeowners when we're approached to say, yeah, this will work here, but this, you want to stay away from that. And they are really our resident experts.
Okay.
Thank you for your question. Anyways, this is a snapshot at looking back from that prior shot. And then if you don't continue to maintain it, it's kind of like an unmowed yard. It becomes an eyesore in your community. If you don't take care of your things every once in a while, weeds start moving into your grass and the neighborhood declines and everything else. Fuels vegetation and reduction is no different than most of those elements as well. A little bit about property owners, and I touch a little bit, Councilman Wilcox, about some of the more specifics in this particular area. But for recent memory, the city of Prescott has not been engaged in doing what I would say private property work. There's been some work done on private property, usually as part of a grant, but most of that risk potential and mitigation rests to a fairly sizable degree on the individual property owners, whether they're owner-occupied, tenant, or sometimes absentee tenants. We have some means that we try and want to work forward with, but we want to get a little bit more aggressive in some of the homeowner accountability reasons, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the city does work extensively on fuels reduction within city-owned property. Probably most notably recently was the Acker treatment over at Acker Park, where we've worked with some due diligence in order to minimize the risk and ease some of that potential in that particular area as well. Owners of private property in the wildland, they're responsible for the removal of removal of ladder fuels, along with trimming back, pruning up, and removing vegetation from under the trees. removal of all combustible materials and vegetation from under decks. It's kind of like, and I'll use the analogy of, even though the smokers are kind of a rare breed nowadays, but if you take a cigarette and just set it on a bed, very rarely will the bed catch fire. The cigarette will burn to its end. It might burn down a little bit, but in most cases the fire will go out. Using that same analogy in a deck or an under deck area, a cigarette or spark or something, the difference is it becomes insulated around the heating source. And when it becomes insulated, then it becomes problematic for us because then it creates fire and spreads. So one of the reasons under vegetation under decks and combustibles under decks is we don't want that material to get insulated. Same holds true in ladder fuels and those kind of things. Things that start surrounding these sparks or these sources of ignition become insulated, and that's what creates the fire at the ground level. Maintaining defensible space through removals at least annually, much like I used in the mowing the grass. This stuff has to be upkept throughout the life of the property owner, or throughout the life of the property by the homeowner. And then owners of property, private property in the WUI are encouraged to use only fire-resistant plants. Don't see a lot up here, but ice plant is usually very effective in that arena. There's some other plants, and again, I'm not an arborist or that, but there's a number of landscape firms that can assist the property owner in determining what works and what doesn't. Along with, we have some members on staff that can distinguish it probably much better than I can speak to it at that particular level.
Do we have a list that we can hand out to homeowners?
You know, I'm sure that we have a number of pamphlets that show what is good stuff for this particular community, and I know we have a number of those up at Fire Administration that if people were to ask us for them. And, you know, next month, I think it's April 20th, in collaboration with POWIC and Arbor Day, we'll be taking part in the expo to help further some of the public education, at which time those materials would be made directly available to the public.
It might be a good idea to have those lists available at the nurseries like Waters and Prescott Valley, because you can get lists of plants that javelina don't like and lists that deer don't like. And if we had the fire-resistant plants along there, then people could make the right choice of the three.
We most certainly can communicate and will communicate those to the local vendors.
Are we, a question, Chief, maybe from Mark Woodfield, probably better, or our city manager. At one point in time when we had our past water conservation person here, and Sean Rydell, she put out bookmarkers that are out here in the lobby and different places that identify drought-tolerant plants and those types of things. Are we still trying to make a concerted effort to send those in our water bill from time to time?
Yeah, I believe those are still going out in our water bill.
Okay.
We can get more from the water conservation people if you'd like.
I'm huge about the education element of that with the fire department, because if we do nothing as far as educating people that are new coming into the community, you know, and they should even have a rack of them in the building department when somebody's building their house to be able to firsthand touch those things and know what they should plant in their yard.
Right. Councilman, there will be a presentation of our updated water conservation program at your workshop of April 7th.
Thank you.
You know, I think the information for how to be fire-wise is pretty readily available if you want to get to it. What I have seen as the biggest problem is motivating people to get out there and actually do it. You know, I think sometimes it takes a big scare for us to motivate ourselves to get out there and do that. When we had the Indian fire, my company used to do cleanups through there, and we'd have 1 or 2 trucks full. Well, after the Indian fire, I think we took 7 trucks loaded with pine needles out of that area, and it took that big of a shock. And any of us that hung out in the forest, you know, there are 8 inches of pine needles sitting on the ground, and it just took that kind of shock to motivate people to do that. And I don't know how it happened in Dosey. I haven't really been out there that much, but do you see after that event people do more? Because I you know, prevention doesn't sell is what I've always heard.
Yeah, pardon me. On a couple fronts. One is, if I remember rightly, my wife actually shared with me the water bill insert within the last 2 months that that particular information was communicated through the water bills. And prevention, you know, is regretful sometimes, but operations really exist for when prevention fails. And it makes such an investment on the front end to the response piece of this, and the dollars that a true response costs is very costly. It's kind of redundant, but the preventative measure, and as we move forward, I think that is one of my proposals, is that we intensify that effort through the public educational piece as part of this as well.
Chief, as we've witnessed in the past, it might be costly for prevention, but it's more costly if you do nothing.
Most certainly.
And that includes enforcement of the codes we've put in place.
You're exactly right.
And Chief, I think in June of each year, I think we provide free slash drop-off for residents at Sundog. So I think that's like every Saturday in June.
Right. There's a variety, and you know, the one challenge that we're faced is, to some degree, our demographics here. There's probably not many days that go by that we don't have a fairly senior member of our community inquiring about our fuels reduction needs, and you know, making the resources available for them to do that with the least amount of physical exertion. And sometimes it's just pointing, and in most times it's mostly pointing people in the right direction to do something about it. We're rather fortunate that you know, our socioeconomic element, people do have a tendency to want to do something for their own, help themselves a little bit here, especially for those in the WUI areas. And with that, what we've tried to do, and I think what you'll see a little later on, is providing a platform for the community to continue to have a fairly robust fuels reduction effort at a more efficient acceptance of how we do things.
I don't want to get too far ahead of your presentation, but is there an effort through the fire department to meet semi-annually, maybe, or annually with the homeowners association in the WUI area to determine what those homeowner association common spaces can do to protect their areas?
Well, we have a model program when it comes to FireWise, as administered through both the city of Prescott and the surrounding districts. But the key role player in that is POWIC and the Prescott Area Wildland Urban Interface Commission. And they meet monthly. They are high energy folks. I hope I have so much energy when I'm ascended to their age limit, because there's some folks there that are just really movers and shakers in helping this community help themselves. And through those resources and getting the community engaged, I attend the meetings fairly regularly. They're the first Thursday of every month. I don't hit every one of them, but I've made it a point since I arrived last summer. I don't think I missed but two. I have a pretty good understanding of what that group does. On the same token, all the stakeholders are at that location at that time. And Prescott, you know, we can puff out our chest a little bit on that one, is we have more FireWise communities, I think, than anywhere else in this country, which is a great step for those that have walked my shoes before me. But equally important is they're engaged. They do so much for so little, and everything from having an ice cream social to help them raise monies to defer some of their costs to their homeowners. And the Homeowners Association, the one I'm probably most familiar with is Yavapai Hills, but there's a number of homeowners associations where we'll provide guest speakers when it's a topic of interest for their community members, and we make that connection, and I definitely see that need to continue as we move forward in this particular community. Moving forward, Zone 1 kind of notes that it has to have non-fire resist. I think that should have no more than 20% non-fire resistive vegetation. Ornamentals must be hydrated through a sprinkler system and maintained to minimize the fire risk. And that's, again, only 0 to 10 feet out from the property, but that's the area that allows us to clearly make a stand on saving a property. shifting gears a little bit and took the liberty with this is wildfire hazard poses the most serious continuous threat to this community. We have to manage the hazard and requires an enforcement stance to protect our citizenry. With that, it's, you have some mitigation, you have some court enforcement, you have some code accessibility, but as much as anything else, we have to realize, and I think we've already beat that horse a little bit, but the risk here is severe. Some of the WUI code enforcement, regretfully, as with most codes, they become a little bit reactive versus proactive. A lot of times it isn't until a citizen doesn't work at the first echelon and doesn't get along or can't get a solution through his neighbor that he'll bring it forward or she'll bring it forward. We don't have the human resource strength to be out dictating and code enforcement. I think, we do what we can with the resources we're provided, but that is a piece that there's a gap still that exists, and I think as we look forward, maybe that's something that we need to intensify a little bit.
Thank you for making that comment, Chief, because here again, acknowledging everything that you're saying with regards to the severity of risk with wildland fire in a community like Prescott. It takes personnel with the proper training and knowledge of how wildland fire functions and moves, not just folks that are arborists or folks that are landscapers. It takes personnel that understand wildland fire. And I think it's important at a budget study session to keep demonstrating that in order to keep this community safe, this community needs to keep employed the personnel that are necessary to make sure that the movement of potential wildland fire is minimalized as much as we can, and that takes people. So I just think it's really important to keep beating that drum.
Thank you for your comments. Some of the fundamental work, working with homeowners to resolve issues within reasonable timeframes. We don't have a defined time to turn a request around. That said, we're very responsive. When somebody comes in, as recent, I saw it yesterday afternoon, a customer or client wanted some information, and we basically provided one-stop shop, and we get stuff on the schedule fairly quickly to do some what we call profiling, and not in the ethnic term, but profiling of structures and what their risk potential are. That said, moving forward, I think we need to determine a matter of policy that the WUI code be further enforced more actively, and that perhaps we explore our code enforcement officers to have citation capabilities to issue citations for non-compliance issues where we can, and I think that will strengthen some of this. But again, it has to be a holistic approach. There is not one solution to the fuels reduction challenges that the community is faced with.
Chief, on Tuesday, we hopefully addressed a lot of those concerns with some amendments to our code for code enforcement. So,
yes, Councilman Loiselle, I was absent from the Tuesday meeting, but I've kind of caught up through it courtesy of the Daily Courier and that, and what the agenda was. And I feel very confident that we're moving in a very proactive way in helping us do our jobs on the code enforcement on a variety of levels, not only the WUI stuff, but from the other stuff that's been playing out recently. A little bit about the city role in wildfires, fuels reduction, and firefighting in general. I'm not going to go into the finer details. I'm not going to profess to try to make everybody a fire expert. That's why I hope I'm being compensated for the job I'm doing, and the men and women that you have approved through the appropriation process. But wildland firefighting, it's a little different than it is structure firefighting. It's a little different than it is a hazardous materials response or a technical rescue response or a emergency medical response. I commonly refer to the Prescott Fire Department as a all-risk response agency, that we're not the master of one trade, we're the master of many trades. A little bit about the wildland firefighting capabilities specifically. Should a plume develop, we have up to 3 levels of initial response elements that will respond to that smoke call. It usually originates by a 911 call. As with most historical events, if it's a big fire, we get big number of calls for 911. It's not just one. It's not unusual, and a good example that I always reference is one of my, as I call it, career events in my life, was an airplane crash into a community. We received no less than 1,200 911 calls, to the point the 911 system was saturated and everything's rolling over to our sister public safety answering point. Big fires around here drive calls into the PRCC, and then they're responded to by a inclusive group of Prescott Fire Department resources, United States Forest Service, state fire resources, along with our mutual aid partners, Grim Creek, Central Yavapai, Chino Valley, wherever the organization is. I must attest that the community up here has probably one of the most robust automatic aid systems outside of the valley, as far as there are no borders for our response. It's not unusual that a structure fire in our community may engage a engine company from Chino or Central Valley or Central Yavapai. It's also not unusual that we, through the economy of scale, add capacity by having those partnerships within this community. State Forest Service, they co-locate with us at Station 71 up on White Spar. I've had the privilege to kind of tour their facilities. I haven't got down to the site down at the airport quite yet. I've met most of the movers and shakers down there. I just haven't had an opportunity to tour their facilities. But we have some of those resources. But initial attack, as it has been, will be, and for the foreseeable future, has always been within the initial response element of the Prescott Fire Department and its mutual and local partners. Extended, whether it be a red truck, a white truck, or a green truck, we work collectively to subside or subdue a risk. Extended attack becomes a little bit more complex, and I've referenced some types here, but the least volatile fire attack is a type 5, and then as you decrease in numbers from 5 down to 1, the more significant the event is. Type 5s and type 4s are usually not expanded beyond the scope of just the authority having jurisdiction, i.e. it's a Prescott fire, it's Prescott resources, maybe an automatic aid engine here or there, but most of those 4s and 5s are handled by just the city of Prescott. Where it gets a little bit more complex outside the initial attack element, and that is when we get into type 1, 2s, or 3s. 3s being a locally available incident management team that we would enlist to help us with the needed overhead to manage an event. It would still involve Prescott Fire Resources. It would still be a culmination of all the automatic and mutual aid agreements. And then type 2 and 1, based upon the severity of the event and the risk potential, they escalate accordingly. Of particular note with the recent history in Prescott, it's not been many seasons that we haven't had a type 1 or 2 or even 3 event in the local area. And local, when I talk local, I talk kind of western Yavapai area of town, not necessarily local to the city of Prescott.
Well, sorry, what is PRCC?
Prescott Regional Communications Center.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And there is a self-fueled myth every once in a while amongst the fire service, and this is not unique to Prescott, it's not unique to Chino Valley or Central, it's not Yuma or even the folks in Maricopa, but the myth exists that off-district responses create a revenue stream for the Prescott Fire Department or any fire agency. At best, it's revenue neutral. We send a unit off district, we get compensated for that unit, we get compensated for the backfill for that unit, but by the time you pay those bills, it's really a revenue neutral. There might be a little bit of over monies coming into the coffers, but it's very slight, and that's usually for the cost of the engine and equipment in the form of rent or hourly rents. The tiered response continuum, it really kind of depends, and I know that's a very abstract term sometimes, but a lot of things can impact what's available at any given time. Especially at the state and the federal levels, because if there's a significant fire, it's kind of like the body. It has a tendency to shunt everything towards where the event is happening at the given time. If it's the heart, blood seems to go to the heart. If it's the limb, you kind of get the picture there. So a tiered response continuum allows us capacity to maintain our abilities here at home, while also supporting organizations outside of our area. As I mentioned earlier, our fire season runs usually from first week of May through June, 4th of July weekend. Hopefully we get the monsoons, and it eases. I've put in control measures that we don't do off-district work during the peak of our fire season. That's necessary because I can't survive the headline test. When I send 3 engines to Payson, and we have a fire erupt here in the heart of our fire season, the headline test doesn't read real good for Dennis Light. And I'd venture to say I'm probably looking for gainful employment elsewhere. So I'm very conservative, probably a little bit more conservative than perhaps other chiefs in other departments, but I do that based upon my personal and professional experience. I don't like to get burned. I also establish a drawdown number, that even when we are out of fire season, that we don't draw down too many resources should an event occur. So I try to maintain best available, best suited agent, closest available units here in our community to serve our community. It's not to say we won't go down to help Central Yavapai, Chino, but that is reciprocal. They oftentimes come here to help us as well. And then I always talk, and I really don't know who coined the phrase, but it's called the chaotic curve. And the chaotic curve in an escalating event starts here, and it's gone so high to the top, we can't get enough resources to manage the event right off the bat. What we try to do is tame the chaotic curve, is throw enough resources at it on the initial fire attack to have a reasonable chance of success. But if you don't have the resources, sometimes we have to protect what we can, and that's what we swear to do to the community, and we will continue to work that way. They're always limited on the front end. If it's fire season here, it's likely fire season over in Payson or the other side of the I-17 corridor, and it varies from season throughout the season, but for the most part, that area is always strapped for resources at the same time. A couple monumental fires in this state's history, Rodeo Chetasky, Monument Fire, both of those taxed the state system, and to be honest with you, the state, the federal system, and even in the Monument Fire, I believe they had resources from south of the border helping out. So it doesn't take long, and therefore we have to have a logical stepping process to get us to full demand to battle the event should they occur. And again, we're anything but alone in our community. The Yavapai County Office of Emergency Services, Denny and Hugh over there, I have a conversation with them probably at least once a month because they also understand the risk potential in our community, and much of that becomes inherent to the emergency management. Halleck, I've mentioned them before, but they're also a very strong partner. And again, that's probably the best stakeholder meeting because it brings the community and the responders together in a structured format, facilitated by Bob Betts and his executive board. But there's some resident experts that they call on, and they call on us.
Question, Chief.
Yes, sir.
You talk about Pollock. Is BLM participate in that? We have a lot of BLM land here in Arizona.
I believe BLM, Bureau of Land Management, does have representation there. And again, I haven't been to every meeting, but, you know, it's like most meetings. You don't get a 100% attendance every time, but all the stakeholders that I'm familiar with, and that would include Bureau of Land Management lands, have representation there.
Well, it baffles me in the height of fire season why anybody who knows how fire works would take a position of let it burn without putting out a fire the immediate when it starts. With the amount of fuel that we have on the ground, whether it's BLM, whether it's Forest Service, whether it's the City of Prescott, whatever the case is, why somebody would take the position of let it burn. And I just want to make sure that BLM is participating in this, because there's a lot of BLM land that's in this area that subjects communities, not just Yarnell, but Prescott and other communities, to catastrophic wildfire, and they need to clean up their land. It's not just incumbent on the citizens of Prescott to pay to clean up land all over the state of Arizona. It's incumbent on us to take care of what we can take care of for the citizens of Prescott. But the federal government, the state government, the county government, they all got to be just as accountable for taking care of their liability as what Prescott's been put in a position of trying to take care of.
Thank you for your comments. And POWIC actually, by its nature, does a lot of that for us. It helps us bring together the different stakeholders. You know, I can't talk specifically about different jurisdictions or different levels of government's philosophies. One of the things here locally is, you know, and I kind of drill down, you know, there's a customer service piece to this. And, you know, a long time ago, and I'll tell a little story here, you know, people used to ask, well, do fire departments respond to cats in trees? And that's a very abstract question, and it's a catch-22. Because in one citizen's mind, that red truck going out to that cat in the tree is a waste of a finite resource. As a fire chief, I don't make that an emergent call. It's not like we're rolling lights and sirens to cats in the trees. But the downside, if we don't do something to help the customer's need at the time, is I have a young child decide to climb a ladder, the ladder falls against a power pole, and I have a true emergency. So people ask me, Chief, why do you respond to cats in the trees? I respond because we're probably the better equipped to do something about it. Initial fire attack's the same way. We will send, we chase smoke a lot of times here. Guess what? People have fireplaces. It's not unusual in the season. And this time of year, where it's kind of transitional in weather, we'll chase smokes all the time because there's prescribed burns going elsewhere. There's people just barbecuing. But we provide that service, and initial response is all part of that. Some of our other partners now.
Chief, I
yes, Mr.
just had a comment on that. And I know it's a catch-22, but when you start responding to the proverbial cat in the tree, aren't you feeding it? It's like a vicious cycle.
Actually, it's not if you do the interrogatory right on the front end. And not to get sarcastic up here, there's some questions you can ask that will elicit a right response. And again, we don't take from the heart attack. We don't take from any of these others. And it doesn't open the gates as much as people would imagine. It's you know, it's kind of like a disabled or a struggling bird in Watson Lake. You know, do you want the young child swimming out there to help tend to that bird, or do you want somebody with the right equipment and that to perhaps offer it? And, you know, sometimes it's about just good relations and being able to say, you know, we'll work to say yes, but sometimes we say no. And, you know, the cat in the tree is just a kind of a cheesy analogy.
I understand, but I know that that you guys have rolled on, a broken water pipe in somebody's house. The phone book is full of about 80 people that attend to that, and not the fire department.
Right, and that's where we kind of curtail our service, though. We don't go in. We will help the homeowner locate the water shutoff, because a lot of homeowners aren't familiar, or the property owner. In fact, we had one that was shared with me this morning on the way into work at the Dairy Queen down off Willow Creek and downhill. Thank you. You know where it's at. A little late.
There used to be two, there's only one now.
Yeah. Well, there's still two. There's one of them. Firefighter know where the Dairy Queens are. But they called us at a fairly ungodly hour, about 1 o'clock, after they tried to secure the water and nobody could locate. They finally found the location, but they couldn't shut it off. And, you know, there is as I mentioned earlier, the life, environment, and property. You know, we feel that that's a right response, and I'll continue to operate that way until, you know, there's a policy direction that shifts that. But again, it's not emergent stuff. It's kind of the benign, you know, and to some degree we are a standing army for some things.
Well, Chief, I would think it would be worth it to respond to 50 calls of smoke that don't matter to catch the one that does.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, most certainly. And there's no reservations in that. And, you know, as much of our emergent business changes, or has changed over the course of my career, the way we do things and respond has definitely changed too. Some of the stuff that used to be true emergencies, you know, a fire alarm no longer gets necessarily a full complement unless there's some substantive follow-up call that says, hey, this is the real thing. It may just get the first due engine company.
Well, and we know when we're on pins and needles, you know, it's when in May and June.
Most certainly. Yeah, it helps to have a defined period of operation. Some of the other partners, and again, I'll not to elongate, but United States Forest Service, the green trucks of the part of this great state, they do a remarkable job. I've met with most of the folks, Pete Gordon and his understudy, as well as the folks at the Bradshaw District and the Prescott District. You know, they all want to work together and collectively, and that's what's very positive about this community. Western Eastern Yavapai County Chiefs, each year prior to fire season, we pull all our resources in order to pull together what's called a basin drill. It's coming up in, I think it's April 13th, 14th timeframe, at which time we work on some of our initial attack stuff so we aren't caught off guard. There's some minimum requirements that all our firefighters need to go through, shelter deployment and those kind of things that we work through. Part of that relationship also allows perhaps an engine company from Sedona backfilling into our firehouse here to allow our folks to take part in that training, therefore not reducing our capacity to respond. And then the local and automatic aid partners, Central Yavapai, Chino Valley, and Grim Creek. A little bit about what happens in the hazard assessment and treatment services world. Oftentimes through our fire administration number 777-1700, a resident will contact the fire department to schedule assessments. Structures on the property are then profiled and explained to the owner. This is kind of a little bit of hand-holding, but it's easier to hand-hold and educate and tell them, you know. And usually what we'll use is some different colors of ribbon tape and tell them this probably needs to go, this can stay, this may not, you might need to cut this one up, and provide them direct instruction on how to do that. We do not, as I mentioned earlier, we don't cut trees or prune trees or compete with landscaping services for those services, but we will provide a homeowner the knowledge that they can enlist somebody without being taken advantage of. And I think that's a critical service to our community, is that we help and look out for our citizenry as well. We explain to the property owner their responsibilities under the Wildland Urban Interface Code and describe how they can be met. Usually there's a couple different ways of doing things, whether it be through irrigation, whether it be through trim and treatment and pruning. So we try to educate them and let them decide the best course for them to take. We will make arrangements with the homeowners associations for some of the chipping and hauling away at designated locations. Sometimes this is as simple as working through the Firewise community to enlist a vendor to provide dumpsters into a homeowners association so people can take their slash to that location versus having to get it down for our June offering down at the landfill. And then treatment of certain areas is accomplished by funding grants and external agencies. And You know, some of you joined us in the latter part of December before the New Year's holiday to look at one of our success stories at Camp Yavapines. That's about 98% complete. The United Christian Youth Camp is currently in this current year, and I'll go a little bit more detail in the grants, but we met yesterday, I believe it was, or the day before, with representatives from Embry-Riddle to get a letter of support from Embry-Riddle to do some mitigation work out there in time to hopefully accomplish it, or if we're awarded the grant, to accomplish it prior to the 4th of July festivities at Pioneer Park. As everybody's aware, it butts up against, and each year we're kind of like waiting, is the rain going to come before the fireworks have to go, or what the story is in each year. So we want to do some mitigation work to ease that ongoing concern that comes up or seems to surface every July. A little bit about organization and comparisons, manpower, staffing. The Prescott Fire Department, in our current configuration, we have a division chief that oversees. Darrell Willis, as you're aware, retired or resigned just recently. He also provided some collateral support services duties. He was my go-to person, so to speak, for interaction with the Prescott Regional Air Communications Center. He was the designee for the emergency management role within the city, along with some of the fires and facilities needs within our own organizational infrastructure and apparatus. He vacated the position, and we've also had Ted Ralston a few weeks before Darrell opted to pursue other endeavors, and he resigned his position. So right now we're basically a 2- and 3-person shop with about 5 seasonal folks that are doing the work, and we've just recently asked for a grant extension for the one of the 90-10 grants, and I'll get to the specific grants in a moment, to continue that work. But in comparison, Flagstaff Fire Department, their fuels reduction division, staff with a fire management officer, and again, I put, just for clarification, their retirement systems that they're making contributions on their behalf for, but he is in Arizona State Retirement System. Paul Sommerfeld. Paul and I date back like a decade and a half ago when we first crossed paths in this profession. He does his work as oversight for their fuels reduction program. They have a wildfire education coordinator and a fuels crew leader, and those 3 are full-time equivalents, along with the employment of seasonal employees. Depends on the season and funding, but that's anywhere in a range from 10 to 15 folks.
Chief, how long have those positions, like the fire management officer and Flagstaff and their fuels reduction department, have they been under the ASRS?
For all I understand, I can't answer that question. I just don't know.
I mean, it's not new. Would you know it's?
I would say it is probably not new, and the reason being, Paul and I went in like the early 2000s to class back at the National Fire Academy, and he was doing the job back probably 2003, 2004, so probably a decade ago.
Okay, thank you.
I would expect.
And this is the big unanswered question in my mind. Is your fire management officer, is he a firefighter? And if so, why is he in Arizona State? Your fuels crew leader, is he a firefighter? If so, why is he in Arizona State? And I'm not asking you that question because I'm just saying that question has not been answered yet, I don't think. And on these seasonal employees, 10 to 15, up in Flagstaff, what system are they on? Are they on any system whatsoever?
Yeah, and I don't have the finer details of that, but I'm very respectful of your position on that. I too am a little perplexed, I guess, for the lack of a better term, as to where everything will land. I think, I do sincerely believe that there will be some sorting of the finer points yet to come. Coming attractions, I guess, yet to play out both at the state level, a little less on the federal level. Federal level's pretty clear. Plus they're self-insured and they have a little deeper pockets and those kind of things. But you'll see in the next slide actually a different version. And what I did here was just some environmental scanning of some close folks that were close to us, but Bear Jaw Fire Crew, pardon me, it's actually a joint venture with Highlands, Summit, and Pinewood districts. They have 6 full-time equivalents, 2 from each district, all in public safety retirement system. They perform fuel mitigation and wildfire response. The difference being there is the wildfire response. On the previous slide, from what I've been able to garner in my conversation with Chief Galliard up in Flagstaff, their fuels reduction folks have a very limited role in the response piece of this. They also employ about 15 part-time employees, seasonal not to exceed 5 months, and all are in ARS. So as you can see, it's a pretty diverse spectrum as to how people have managed it. And you know, until our tragedy, I don't know whether we even knew if it was right or wrong. Things just do kind of sort through these things.
Because with this, it says that these people, they're 15 part-time employees. From what we've seen, they're in the wrong system now, too.
Let me address that.
Thank you.
Remember that there are more than just a single criteria for eligibility in PSPRS, and part of a couple of the other criteria are the length of time that one works during the year, as well as whether during the term that they're working, or during the year, they also have to work a certain number of hours in a pay period. In other words, they have to work at least 30. They can't work less than 30 in any given pay period. So if there's a hard commitment by this this fire crew or these entities that these part-time employees are done at 5 months, then there's 2 criteria that they would fail to meet for eligibility, even though it appears that they perform wildfire response. The current criteria essentially requires that they aren't furloughed, that they work at least 6 months, and during that 6 months, they don't work less than 30 hours in a pay period. So if they're furloughed after 5 months, then they wouldn't be eligible. The challenge is when they work more than 6 months, or when there's a commitment to work them year-round. You know, it appears if you go to the top bullet that those are full-time folks, and they're deemed by the employer as firefighters, and they meet all the other criteria.
All right, thank you.
The other one, and I just took a quick snapshot and didn't include the retirement information because it doesn't really parallel, but Santa Fe has a similar fire situation that the city of Prescott faces, and they engage 4 FTEs or full-time equivalents in fuels mitigation and fire response, and then they use 16 part-time equivalents for the seasonal wildfire firefighters and fuels mitigation efforts. Again, they're a little similar in kind of the geography and the fire capabilities that Prescott's faced with, and I do hope to have a little bit deeper conversation with what they're doing out there, because on the public education side, they're running what I would say a best practice in the industry. So I have some further conversations to explore in that particular area. Just talking a little bit about grants. 2 primary grants that the city of Prescott's been fortunate enough to be shared with. Both of these are generated out of the Arizona State Forestry Division. The first being the Wildland Fire Hazardous Fuels Grant. Oftentimes we'll refer to that as the 90-10 grant. The 10% coming from either fiscal outlay of either capital, equipment, personnel, or in-kind type resources, and then the 90% in fiscal match. Most of these, correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I believe all of these are reimbursable grants that we front the money and then get reimbursed based upon our cost accounting. It's a competitive application process. We've been very fortunate. I think for almost the last decade, we've seen some grant, either the State Fire Assistance or the Wildland Fire WFHF grant that we've been fortunate to take from the state. And if you look at some of the other awarding communities that have gotten it, Howick's been one as a individual grantee, City of Prescott, Fry Fire District down in southern Arizona, Sierra Vista area, some of the area around Mount Lemmon, I believe. So most of these are similar in the sense that they have a WUI, or Wildland Urban Interface Challenge, that presents in those communities. The other is the 50/50 grant, and again, both of these are for hazardous fuels reduction and community protection. The difference being in the 50/50, it's also expanded to include information and education and homeowner action. So there is some opportunities there perhaps that we have yet to explore that maybe we need to engage a little bit more on. So those are the two primary grants. Some of the, in the current fiscal year, as I shared already, we're about 98% complete on the Camp Yavapines. We're waiting on the extension for the season. And part of that's due just because our seasonal employees that we brought on to do the work, they took jobs with their other employers. Usually they'll split their work. Sometimes they work for us in the winter to help round out their earning potential, and then go back and work with either the U.S. Forest Service or State Lands Department on the summertime throughout the fire season. So it's not unusual by any means to have the turnover of personnel in that particular discipline. Some of the grant requests I mentioned earlier about the Embry-Riddle. We're looking for a letter of support there to take it to their executive board here within the next week, and then I believe the grant closeout for that is mid-April timeframe, at which time we look to seek monies up to about $200,000, and that brings about a $20,000 local match. And then we think they'll be receptive to our proposal to do some treatments out there, and that will be our main one. And then the State Fire Assistance Grant, it will open again in midsummer. I've asked our Fuels Management Coordinator to kind of look at, as we move forward, what makes for a good project within the scope of work that's allowed in the State Fire Assistance Grant for that application period in the midsummer timeframe. Just briefly, a little bit about current organization and proposed changes to the organization. Currently, and again, that shows the fire chief naturally. Tony Schock is a very valid and very effective resource that I have, and he's really at my fingertips. He works co-located with me. His primary role is the Arizona Wildfire and Incident Management Academies, but he's also, coming from the flatland, he's probably been my best sounding board as I've looked to enhance our capabilities within this community and manage the risk. But probably most important is the operating divisions. The service model that we have is delivered by All Risk Response, Suppression, EMS, Tech Rescue. It's just too vast to list on this particular thing. And that's assigned by the standing army, so to speak, of A Crew, B Crew, and C Crew. Professional services, which includes internal affairs, community risk reduction, and then where the wildland shift was in the aftermath, or after my briefing in the ICMA study back in August 26th of last year, I converted the wildland division by name to support services to make it more encompassing of the services that I needed to look at and expand the role of that particular division chief. There was added capacity at the time. Plus, there was some underlying needs that we needed to address in the emergent, immediate area that we were able to do.
Question.
Yes, sir.
Support services. Personnel in that particular division, are they subject to fighting fires?
At the current time, and what I proposed, the proposal is on the next slide, which will pretty much dissolve support services as it was presented here. Again, this is a remodeling and putting the emphasis is, but the short answer was fire response did not come from support services. No, sir.
Thank you.
Chief, just going back a little bit, when we get the grants, and we did the United Christian Youth Camp, and we went out there and looked what they did a great job, cleared it out, had it fully explained that this gives them a chance to actually fight a fire if it starts coming in. And that was quite a lot of bucks that we spent to get that done. Is there any commitment from UCYC with getting that grant that they keep that area up and clean? Because with your picture that we showed, we could see in 4 years we could be back at square one. When we go in and get these grants and we do these clean out areas, is there any obligation on those people's parts to keep that up?
There is nothing formalized in that per se, but they also, especially those two camps that we're doing, United Christian and Camp Yavapines, there is an obvious commitment because they were the ones that it was a mutually desired outcome. But there is commitment, I felt, when I met with the camp managers and those folks, the caretakers, that this will serve a purpose to get them to where they needed to be, but the mitigation efforts will continue. And again, the slides earlier is a rather quick regrowth. Some of the work there probably won't even regrow because we use the masticator to really kind of chip it down to the finer particles. Mm-hmm. But some of the close-in stuff and creating a defensible space, I felt very confident without going through a lot of hurdles that commitment will and remain for at least for the current managers, and he's been there a good period of time now. So I'm very optimistic on that, but there's always a crapshoot a little bit.
You bet. And when we do that, do we set them up on a schedule where maybe we'll go back in 2 years and say, look, you're not doing it, you are doing it? Do we follow up on that?
Yeah, I'm trying to get it to the point. Right now we don't have the current capacity. I'd like to revisit those every 3 years at the most, so we can at least tag the stuff or tie the ribbon tape to those mitigation efforts that they need to reapply the treatment to in order to remedy the regaining of potential. Anyways, that's how it is as of probably this morning, and that's our organizational structure. Of significant difference, and one of the recommendations under the ICMA study that as I've continued to learn the organization and understand the leadership team within my organization and the city of Prescott, is the co-locating of like duties and responsibilities in a division that has the same sort of mission. Here what you see is a expanded division of our community risk reduction. Don Devendorf is the current division chief over that division. When I got here, I explained to my senior leadership staff that I had to stop the merry-go-round of people moving around in order to make some strategic directional shifts. I told them I would not move, and I do not plan to move anybody physically from one division to another, with the exception of a couple folks here in the fuels management specific area. But I'm not going to change any of the leadership over the divisions until such time as my 1 year of assurance has expired, which will be about probably the 1st of July area, at which time we may realign some folks because they have some skill sets that may be more beneficial elsewhere in the City of Prescott organization. That said, what I've done is pretty much dissolve, and what I'm proposing is to dissolve the wildland division as a operating independent division and roll that mission assignment into fuels management under the direction of a fuels management supervisor. We have two current incumbents in the balance of the wildland division. One has the skill set, traits, capabilities, and abilities to fulfill the role as a fuels management supervisor. And then the other has a very solid background in fuels reduction and the coordination. He is our current fuels reduction technician. He's a doer. Probably the biggest shift will be he'll be a doer, but he'll be doing more of providing directional input to homeowners and that versus physical aspects, because there's an underlying concern in the piece, and Mr. Palladini referred to the different criteria as to what is hazardous work, and we need to define that a little bit better. So some of this will be immediate, some of it is a little longer looking forward. And one of the fuels reduction coordinators' roles, they'll work on the hazard assessments direct with the homeowner. They'll coordinate with the HOAs to get on their agendas to communicate our public educational message to those. And then they'll work to facilitate some fuels reduction contracts in a possible public-private partnerships to execute some of the delivery work of managing the fuels. With that, that's, again, this is kind of looking forward a little bit. There's some pieces that still need to fall in place, but it also brings them all under the umbrella of community risk reduction. Our Prevention Bureau historically does the inspections and investigations. They do developmental plan review. They also serve in planning and zoning and those kind of elements, so it kind of brings it all under the right division in my professional point of view.
Question, Chief.
Yes, Ms.
Just to be clear, under fuels management, you'll have 3 full-time positions, a supervisor, 2 coordinators.
That's what we're looking at. Some of it is grant-funded dependent. We've been successful in each grant that we apply for usually has a percentage that can be attached to overhead costs, and that's what we hope to continue to work forward to defer some of that so it doesn't become an added burden, that we can realize some cost savings by the true flattening of the organization and continue to ease our obligation on the general fund.
And how many seasonal brush crew or fuels management crew?
Right now, it's kind of, I'd have to say undetermined if there'll be, to what degree we will use seasonal employees. There's some underlying concerns with the Affordable Care Act, as you know, it's the 30-hour rule, or actually it's less than 30 hours for those employment modes. There's some obligations that come forward with federal unfunded mandates that we have to fulfill and continue to filter out. But normally when we apply for a grant, we take into account a labor force, whether it be us doing the work or others, of anywhere from 20 to 12 or 12 to 20, depends which way you're looking at it. So usually you take, depends on the scope of work, and you know, there's not a scientific method as to how much one employee can treat an area, but we have some pretty good empirical data that we understand how many folks it takes, and we gauge that number, or we determine this number based upon the scope of work put forward in the grant application. Some of our work is less labor intensive. We have the, courtesy of council's approval, we had the opportunity to buy a masticator, which, if you see this thing operates, can tear up some ground really quick, and it takes the human resource out of it. But it's a very fluid number, and I'm not prepared today to say, because I don't know what the grants will bring us in the future yet, as to what that number will be determined.
That was a good lead-in for a question that I had. I'd like to go back to a comment you made earlier about not being grant dependent for critical positions, because you don't know when the money's available, or if it's available, or when it goes away. So if indeed the 3 positions that you're talking about, in your professional opinion, you sense these 3 full-time employees are critical to the citizens of Prescott to maintain, I would think it would be incumbent on us to plan on those being looked at for in the budget, not solely dependent on grants.
Oh, I agree. I mean, there is a finite number. I mean, we have to, from a policy perspective, I think collectively we understand, and I think we've, I've painted a significant picture as far as the risk. But the need for fuels treatment and reduction is something that needs to stay in this community. Otherwise, what happened with the Indian fire and the success won't be realized next time.
If I could, let me also comment that earlier in the presentation, the chief highlighted the role of code enforcement, and there was a little bit of discussion of that. So it's my belief that we need these 3 positions full-time. I don't think that they are necessarily grant dependent. There is a continuing and will be a continuing need to perform as a public service in the community interest, hazard assessments, working with the homeowners and so forth, and also working with code enforcement. So as we sit here today, our code enforcement force consists of 2 people. If we have 2 other sets of eyes and ears that are actually out there and focused on wildland-urban interface, those 2 fuels reduction coordinators shown on the chart, then I think that together that is going to be a whole lot better and more effective if these are full-time positions.
Thank you. I'm just, you're the professional firefighter and you're the professional administrator. I just think it's incumbent on us, the policymakers, to understand if indeed it is proposed by the professional firefighter that these are critical positions, that they not be, it's nice to get grants as reimbursement that's usable, but they shouldn't be part of a grant plan. They should be part of a planned expenditure from my perspective. So thank you for your comments.
Councilman Lamberson and Craig and Mayor and Council, the grant expenditure just helps defer some of that cost. So I didn't want to imply that these folks were entirely grant dependent. We have an ongoing mission to manage the risk and the fuels reduction in our community. This is pretty bare bones as to the capability to deliver that service and that expectation of this community. And I'd be really hard-pressed to go numbers any less than what you see on that proposed organizational chart.
Thank you.
But, and fuel reduction will still remain under direction of the fire department.
On public lands, most certainly. On private lands, we will continue to work with the homeowners to provide them the needed direction. And then through kind of the triad of code enforcement, our consultation, and the ability to provide direction to community, then I think you have a holistic approach that's effective in managing the risk.
Chief, a couple of questions. The grant opportunities appear to be 90 and 10 and 50-50.
That's correct.
Okay. So the grant opportunity, those grants would generally be for work that has to be accomplished. The grant would not be to support our full-time people. So if there was a grant opportunity for an HOA, for an example, or that private property. So the city would still be investing 10% in that private property fuel reduction. Is that kind of where it would go?
I think I follow you there, Mayor. Yes, I mean, we have some contribution to help tell them what work needs to be done. Homeowners have some opportunities that they can apply for. I believe the Wildland Fire Hazardous Fuels Grant is one of those. It's not just attached to government entities. Actually, it's a State Fire Assistance Grant. I apologize. It's the 50-50 grant, at which time they can make up part of their 50% contribution through the exercise of us using our fuels reduction coordinators or our fuels management supervisors in the fulfillment of their scope of work.
Okay. Do you see that coordinator through a potential grant would also be able to contract the physical work out to the private sector that's in that business?
That's one possibility. You know, as a, you know, you know, we put down here fuels reduction contracts, but I would say it was more in a facilitation role versus the contracting piece. Most of the folks that would be incumbent to this position probably don't necessarily have the exact skill set to negotiate contracts, and we have a fairly solid regimen that we negotiate contracts within the city for different services already, and I would look to perhaps use some of those available resources, Pam over at in Stephanie Miller's shop, to help us with that piece. But that is one model. Again, there's some in 2016 we're still looking at some of the best practices and how best to accomplish that, and again, to what degree other folks bring resources to the table also plays into that as well.
Yeah, I think where I'm still gun shy is what is fuel reduction, and at what level, if the city is directly involved in that, is what level is our participation into the hazardous duty type work that has been defined, and fuel reduction, cutting trees, chipping, and so forth. Our recent experience, that was considered hazardous duty, which was not an ASRS function. And how do we stay out of that trouble again?
If I might, Mayor and Council, and from what I'm hearing, I think that Chief Light is talking about as one model is that the actual boots on ground grunt work, fuels reduction that the city undertakes as a function of getting the grants would actually be contracted out to private sector. That's a model in lieu of or instead of seasonal city employees. Chief, you know, and again, there's I won't go anywhere into sort of the operational benefits and negatives and positives that the chief did mention some of the other factors, I guess, that would come into play, one of them being Affordable Care Act. I think and again, this is from the narrower standpoint of risk management and liability issues, I think we would support that model, again, not to address the operational issues, but we would support that model for that reason, for the reason you bring up in terms of retirement systems and the costs thereof, because if it's simply a contract to a private vendor, that vendor then, there aren't city employees, there is no retirement issue question. It's not even an issue of they're an ASRS. It just doesn't exist because they're no longer city employees. But there's also the other factors that we look at. There's a workers' comp issue because they're the boots on ground are employees of a private entity. So we don't have that workers' comp liability issue. We don't have third-party liability issue necessarily. That if one of our city employees does something, somebody and a private property owner or somebody else gets hurt as a function of that, we have potential, third-party liability. Obviously, these are risk pool generally covered issues, but normally speaking, when we hire a vendor to perform services for the city, we require that vendor then to have certain levels of insurance. So from that, again, that narrow risk management liability viewpoint, I think our view is that the contracting out of that actual boots on ground grunt work service, even that we pay for with grants, and I think the grants, if I'm not wrong, allow for us to actually hire private companies. That would be our preferred model, as long as I think the prioritization obviously has to be the operational effectiveness of it would obviously be your sort of your first priority. But you know, so you don't want to the tail to wag the dog. But that would be our preferred model.
Okay,
from that standpoint.
I totally understand the contracting out, but I thought I heard somewhere in the conversation that it might be opportune for the city to have some seasonal risk reduction employees working directly for the city, and that's and maybe I heard it wrong.
Yeah, well, we're still in a transitional phase too. We've been doing that practice through the current season. As I look forward, as the organization looks forward, I think we have to look at a way to minimize that exposure to the city as far as some of the risk, and risk in this case being the litigious risk that we could very well face if we don't change our model.
Okay.
And that, so we're just not there yet.
Okay.
And again, some of that has to evolve.
Just one further question, and it's really kind of off the subject, but as a part of your interpretation of your department, are all Prescott firemen wildland certified?
All our firefighters in the response operational piece of that are all wildland firefighters.
Okay.
They are credentialed as firefighters 1 and 2, which both firefighter 1 and firefighter 2 curriculums have a wildland piece. There's a number of S courses that we also mandate for our folks, and if they don't have it prior to an assignment on a red truck, they're provided that block of instruction.
Okay, Jim, or I'm sorry, Chris.
Yeah, Mayor, just kind of along the same lines, I think, you know, one of the questions is the city going to mitigate all this risk? And I think the answer is absolutely not. And we had the lady 2 days ago in here talking about how she went and polled her neighbors, and most of them had lived here for 5 years or less. Well, you know, growing up here, I think one thing was real obvious to everyone that lived in Prescott, and that was if you live in the Pines, you're rolling the dice. And seeing the growth that I've seen, you know, I think about going out Copper Basin Road. When you got to Sheriff's Posse Road, you were at the end. I mean, there was nobody left. Now, that goes a couple miles further of paved road into the forest. There's trees right over the top of people's houses. One of the big fire risks I always hear is that something's going to start out of Walker and it's going to roll through that pretty rough terrain and come right into Prescott through the ranch. You know, the ranch used to have forest that was so thick, if you walked a little bit into it, you could get lost. There's a lot of personal responsibility, I think, in this too, to make your house fire wise. And you know, people always saying they want to support wildland firefighters, and I think one of the best ways, if you want to do that, is to create defensible space. So I'm glad we're still going to have someone coordinating this. It's good to see that code enforcement might get a little bit involved and get a little more onto it, but the city can only do so much. We're surrounded by millions of acres on 3 sides of us. So it's going to take people doing their part too, and I don't really know how much you can do on a dry June day when the wind is blowing at 35 miles an hour and someone's careless at a campground. I think it's absolutely insane that the state's allowing fireworks in Arizona. That's like I keep waiting to see that happen out at the Lynx Lake campground or something like that. And you guys, you know, a tip of the hat to you guys last year. I know that there was a couple fires in Walker, and you jumped out there with the Walker people and our other partners. You put them out fast. We had a big wildfire going on in between here and Chino, and Chino joined us. We joined out there. We put it out. You guys' initial attack has really helped us out last year, and I hope that tradition continues with us. So please continue on. It looks like you're doing a lot of good things moving forward. Thank you.
Jim.
Thank you, Mayor. Go back to what you said here just a moment ago with the mayor's question. You said all of our firefighters are wildland fire certified, 1 and 2. Did I hear that correctly?
In the attack side of things, yes.
On the
fire
attack side of things. Who sets the standards for the mitigation that needs to take place? You know, we bought, you know, codes that we've voted up here, that we've applied. And those codes are based on you guys. You guys told us here's what needs to be done to be fire safe. Am I correct?
That's correct.
So if you go out and contract for somebody that's outside of the fire department to go out there and mitigate, who inspects their work? Who sets the standard for their work? And if indeed all of our fire people, firemen, are all wildland firefighters who would be subject as an initial response to go fight a fire, are we going to have new personnel with regards to the proposed 3 full-time fuels management supervisors, et cetera, that are being proposed outside of the public safety retirement system? I mean, would they be subject to responding to a fire?
Those folks would not be subject to respond to a fire. Those folks would most certainly provide some degree of technical expertise, much like in a building environment when we have a building manager show up to a scene. They provide certain technical intricacies that they're familiar with. They understand fuels, they understand topography. They would serve more in a liaison capacity, but they have no response role in this current model. The response role rests with those that are on public safety retirement, that staff our 5 fire stations with a minimum staffing number of 17, 24/7, 365. Back to the other piece to that is, and if there's a point of confusion, I apologize if I brought it forward, but the ability to respond to wildland fire is not the same as the ability to determine fuels reduction needs. They're 2 different sort of disciplines. All our rolling stock folks, or guys and gals that ride the red trucks, aren't all in tune with vegetation management and fuels reduction. That would become the primary role of the fuels coordinator in the 2 subordinate positions.
Thank you for that, because there's still a little bit of confusion as to who does what. I mean, I'm trying to get through this, especially with regards to wildland fire, is probably the most critical danger that faces the citizens of Prescott. And we're looking at possibly getting grants to supplement the mitigations that I'm sure, as a private property owner in the city of Prescott, I'm subject to the codes of the wildland fire code, that I need to take care of my property. And when we take those dollars, either from the federal government, the state government, whoever it is, the 90-10, the 50-50, et cetera, and we go mitigate private property using those dollars, are we going to be not only in charge of, you inspect my property, are you going to inspect the private property that you just use federal and state money?
I don't know if it's so much an issue of inspect, but I think the enforcement of the code is piece to that. And the enforcement of the code it really needs to be a triad. You need to have the response, you have to have the code, and you have to have the enforcement of the code as well. And then the mitigation, it's mitigation, not elimination. The risk is going to remain, and what we want to do is tame down that particular risk.
Thank you. I guess enforcement is still one of the critical components to this plan. And I guess my question there would be, where in here do I see enforcement? Let's face it, Prescott's pretty big. Some of the people that we may contract out to use federal and state money may be outside the city limits. Some of those places that I went out and saw were Goldwater Lake, outside city limits, under our responsibility, under our liability, since we own the campground, I guess, out there, park, whatever it is. At what level is our department subjected to making sure through code enforcement that those meet the standard of fire-wise that we're subjecting the private citizens of Prescott to?
That will and become part of the community risk reduction broader strategy. Much like we enforce the building code, the wildland urban interface code will have emphasis added towards just that, and some of that role will rest with those with the fuels reduction coordinator. You know, normally when a property owner has plans come forward, we work with the property owners to identify this stuff on the front end, and then we have a need to be out there. And really what we're looking at is a 3-year model that we revisit some, especially where we have a lot of leverages is in commercial properties. Problem is residential properties are more what's in the urban interface. But, you know, eventually what I'd like to get to is that we're out at those properties on at least a tertiary every 3rd year opportunity to refresh everybody's memory, and then if there's something wrong, fix it.
Thank you. I'm learning here. Thank you.
No problem. Trust me, I learn up here too.
Okay.
A little bit about overall the wildfire hazard reduction and kind of an action plan. From a policy perspective is include the strategy to focus on fuels management and improvement of forest health by removal of excess fuels. As I alluded to early in the presentation, you know, the state and U.S. Forest Service, as early as a decade ago, used to think let it grow uncontained, uncontrolled, and 120 trees per acre was just fine. Well, they've revisited their strategy, and I want to make sure that we kind of follow in that strategy as well, that we reduce those fuels. They're doing a remarkable job on our perimeters to do just that. Probably the one that's most premier is where you have U.S. Forest Service butted up against state lands, butted against the community, and each one as individuals but through a collective effort has done a lot to minimize some of those risks. Seeking out solid funding sources independent of the general fund. You know, I think we need to make it known, and we've done a pretty good job of communicating to our state legislature. Recently, there's been a federal award coming forward through the U.S. Forest Service that we were a signatory to help out. And again, that just shows the partnerships that we're ready to engage and become involved. You know, there's a number of dollars that were attached to some of the fuels reduction in the area, working through the Prescott National Forest, United States Forest Service, and I think those models work good to ease our financial burden at the local level. Working on the collaborative efforts with community members, and really it's an educational piece to property owners. Some folks just have an expectation of government is there to fix and provide all the solutions. As recent as the challenges with the communication system when the Quest line was cut. We had some community members call the 911 center and out ask, well, when's the city going to fix my phone line? So there's a knowledge gap in fuels reduction that it's incumbent upon myself as the fire chief through our community risk reduction to build that awareness. We got a real champion for us in Poway. And the relationship that was solidified long before I hit the ground here is one that I like to explore a little bit further and see where we can have some joint and shared fate elements. And again, those are people that are really engaged and want to do the right thing. We just need to kind of guide them down the path sometimes. And then the hazard mitigation through education and enforcement. The enforcement piece has been lacking. You know, it's very easy. It's not in my neighborhood. It didn't happen. And, you know, the enforcement always seems to tighten up every time there's a smoke plume in the area. We need to be a little bit more proactive and not wait until the complainant calls, hey, my neighbor says. We need to be out in the neighborhoods. And I think this presents with enough capacity to survey some of those Firewise communities and provide direction to the Firewise champion in that particular neighborhood to communicate what's needed to address that specific need. Because every one of them, I think there's 22 of them, that each one of them is slightly different for one reason or another. and you have to tailor your effort to that hazard that's presenting itself. Go ahead, Mayor.
Just one more question. Do you see an opportunity with the newfound success you're having with dealing with Central Yavapai and Chino? Do you see an opportunity that the county might become involved with us in a similar enforcement strategy, maybe working through the Wildland Interface group of where you have city limits one side of the street and the other side of the street, and we try to take care of our side of the street, but the other side is still lacking. Do you see opportunities of pursuing those options?
There's ample opportunities. There has to be a will as well. When I've had conversations at the technician level as a fire chief, we all understand the risk. The policy groups differ a little bit sometimes, and that's not unusual. I know from the conversations I've had, there is a renewed interest, I think, based upon the success that Prescott has had in fuels reduction, for some of the others to get on board with that philosophical shift that there's incumbent upon homeowners and property owners to become engaged in this particular business more so. They have the same challenges that we face, rising pension costs and the need to balance a budget and those kind of things. And they also have some resources that they're also partners with POWIC. Rick Chase regularly meets the Fire Marshal for Chino Valley, Central Yavapai, and they regularly meet at POWIC, and we have good conversations just about that collective effort.
And, Mayor, we are all in this same fight together, and was talking with the gentleman that the Dosey fire came right up to his property, and he had weed whacked like a 5-foot wide stretch, and our Prescott fire engines were the ones that were out there at that area. They watered it down, and that's where the fire stopped, So even though it's outside the city, we're still putting our people in jeopardy by chasing after these fires. And is it in Prescott's interest? Without a doubt. We'd like to stop it before it comes in. But Dosey, Indian, all those were outside of the city limits.
Right.
Yeah, and just to add a caveat, real basic, the fires are going to happen one way. They're going to either start in our community and expand to the urban interface, or they're going to start outside of our area and expand into the city.
Yep.
There is no border. There's no wall we can put up. There's nothing that we can do. All we can do is act upon our preventative measures to the best of our abilities. And I feel pretty confident as we move forward, we'll continue to do that and meet this community's needs. The nonprofits, local, state partnerships, I think we beat that dead horse pretty hard. It is a very engaged community membership. And with that, they're what really helps us deliver the message. Some of the milestones as we move forward for the balance of this current fiscal year. I look to leave vacant the division chief and fuels management supervisors unfilled. I don't see a need right at the moment while we're in transition to immediately fill those positions. I'd like to reassign the current wildland division administrative assistant. Marcia Collier has a robust wealth of knowledge in fuels mitigation. She's taken it upon her own initiative to obtain the needed credentials to fulfill that role. And with that, I met with them because I didn't want them to get overly surprised by this morning's presentation, because it has a direct impact to 2 employees currently on staff. So I met with them earlier this morning and kind of shared that, and I've been able to garner a head nod, and it's different for them, and I'm very sensitive to that. Change is hard. Fire service change seems to add some added complexity sometimes due to our culture, but I think organizationally that they've embraced this move forward as far as flattening of the organization. And then kind of key to this is conducting a resource inventory of equipment, vehicles, and infrastructure. First off, to ensure we got what we've been empowered with and we have that available. And then, if there is a need, and I'm not talking a fire sale here by any means, there's always a need to maintain certain amounts and levels of cached equipment for needs. There's some other partner agencies that some of our equipment may become very much more useful for them, so we need to look forward to that and see what those might be. And then complete the current round of grants and apply for the new fiscal year 16 grants. A little bit more, and this is key to moving forward. This is an actual capital item within my proposed budget this year, is to get some technical assistance through the Commission on Fire Accreditation International to develop 2 documents. Basically, one is a standards of cover document that defines what and how we respond in our community to the various types of all risks that we have, whether it be fire, emergency medical services, technical rescue, wildfire, hazardous materials, or any other gambit, disaster preparedness, airplane crashes. But we need a comprehensive document that shares us how to do that. And that's a first step. And then the second is I need a roadmap. As a fire chief, you know, it's nice to know where you're going, but to get a true roadmap and provide direction, I need to engage a few folks outside of my organization, to include representation from the elected officials, representation of our partner agencies in developing a strategic management plan that furthers the strategic objectives of this and future councils as they move forward. You know, there's some planning areas that I want to look at. Infrastructure or assets is one, personnel is another, community risk reduction in its general sense. But I need something to help do that and provide some sort of performance indicators as to what success looks like as we move forward. It's all fine and good for me to say, yeah, I think we need to do this, but I need to be able to define all elements of that. And I think I've worked with these folks specifically before. They are in this business of providing coverages. They actually work hand in hand with the International City County Managers Association on a lot of their deliverables, and they provide a true risk assessment specific to fire, and I think that will be a great stepping stone for us to chart our course. And then development of the plans described above before we change any role to our suppression forces. You know, it's all fine and good to say, well, I think they should be doing this or that, but I'm not sure we always have the added capacity within a firefighter's workday to do those things. Right now, I'll try to quantify it real briefly. Every year, every firefighter has to go through roughly 200 hours of suppression-based training. They have about 200 hours of emergency medical services training. You have roughly at least 40 to 80 hours of hazardous materials training. You have a similar amount to technical rescue and the other disciplines, plus wildfire. And then add to that, you have a call volume of about 9,000 calls for service in any given year. And through that, the hours become a finite number as to what added capacities you can do. Plus you have public appearance requests. So before we change anything in the way our suppression folks work, I would really, especially as it relates to fuels reduction, I'd look at kind of a holistic model that we kind of capture all the bases. Wrapping up here, kind of review the current fuels reduction activities and provide options for adjusting service. I'm not stuck in one particular model. I think there's some best practices out there. I'm just not that ready to say this is the way we have to go. This is a proven strategy. There's some stuff that we just need to get a little bit more detail on, and by no means am I kicking the can down the road on this by any means. What I want to do is make sure when we, so to speak, pull the trigger on change, that change is thought out, it's engaged, and we've engaged the community in that. Community involvement is part of that as well. Conduct further assessment, best practices, touched on that, and current levels and models for increased capacity. We need to be able to add, because as soon as, you know, I noticed at the top of the Prescott Lakes Parkway there, the new development going off to the right, and those are all new developments. As development increases, that's less of a threat in that particular area because of the fuels, but you can see where good fuels management works. in this community, and we want to keep that up. And then we need to look and implement models in FY16 and adjust further benefit in 17 in the out years. The financial piece, again, kind of some general numbers here. Wildland firefighters are the hot shots and fuels mitigations, not really even revenue neutral. And again, this is purely informal as far as auditory responsibilities, if that's a word. But $200,000 to $300,000 per year has been required. Providing fire suppression firefighters for off-district operations, it's not really a moneymaker. It is usually revenue neutral at best. That said, there's a role for that. We need to continue in our succession planning to ensure that we have capable firefighters coming up through the ranks to act as part of an incident management team should we have an event here. And the only way to garner that experience and that exposure is to do some off-district stuff. But those numbers are very finite. It's not a number of 20% drawdown as is recommended by some of our professional organizations. If I were to draw down 20%, that's doing nothing for this community. So I'm looking at maybe a 5 to 7% drawdown at any given time for off-district work. That I think we can absorb within our organization. Expenditure of some general fund monies for fuels reduction is going to be necessary, and it's an important investment in our Firewise communities, and then continue to pursue the grants as they become available. Just a snapshot as far as the estimated operating cost for FY 214 and 15. This is as of a couple days ago. Our total expenditures through the general fund for the current year is about 180 and a half, 181. With that, some of our estimated operating expenses deferred by grants and that come in. So running that division's a rather costly venture. I think that we will see some cost shifts there, that it'll ease some of those obligations that it's been in the past. Proposing moving forward for next year, the organization is to dissolve the wildland division and roll into comprehensive risk reduction to address the all risk control efforts. The staffing for personnel, as was aforementioned in the organizational chart. Again, these are, I have 2 incumbents and 1 person that will be recruited for, a fields reduction coordinator and a fields management supervisor. And then the budgetary is to be finalized based upon further discussion, direction from yourselves and others. And then grant matches, personnels, and typical training. And with that, I'd be honored to entertain any questions that you might have. Hopefully, I'll still get you out before 3 o'clock this afternoon, but hopefully it's been enlightening, and I stand ready to answer anything that you may have.
Questions? Just we've got somebody that needs this room at 11:30, so just a general statement from me, but I'm sure I'm speaking for the entire council. I think we're glad to have you as our fire chief.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.